negotiations have been going on for 10 years. The reason it's been so difficult has kind of been over this process called marine genetic resources. So the life and the benefits the deep ocean can give us, they're very potentially beneficial. So there have been lots of drugs developed from the deep ocean, and countries were negotiating how those could be split between richer and poorer nations.
So now this deal has come to fruition. The details were released overnight, so we know a little more about exactly what the key areas are. Give us a sense of what they'll be targeting.
So there's three main areas they'll be looking at. The first is marine protected areas. So in the high seas, these are the areas not controlled by any country. Those are going to be put into protected areas, which means there'll be regulation on whether people can fish there, ship there, and do research there. It's hoped this will help some of the marine species recover. The second element is those marine genetic resources I mentioned. So countries have agreed that any discoveries made within the high seas will be shared between countries. And this was really important for those ocean island states, particularly the Pacific nations, because they heavily rely on the deep seas and the oceans, yet they felt like they didn't have the resources to necessarily discover or benefit from those discoveries. And the third element was these environmental impact assessments. So any activities that are now going to happen in these international waters have to be assessed for their environmental impact to make sure they're not damaging marine life.
Is there going to be an overarching body who's going to be overseeing this and controlling this? Because you can imagine there'd be some rogue countries that may go off and try and benefit, as you say, and not necessarily play ball.
So the next step in this is actually getting this legally ratified. So what they're looking for is 60 countries to take this away, adopt this in their national legislation. Obviously, that's not all the countries in the world, but they're hoping that's a significant enough number to make this have an impact. Then the next stage will be to set up what we call a conference of parties. So that's all the different countries that have signed it will get together, and they'll be in charge of assessing and implementing this treaty. How that will exactly be done is still to be negotiated, but it's something we're going to be watching out for.
So when you talked about the Pacific, which is of key interest to us here in Australia, will they be part of the process, or will they just be allowed to share in the work that is done?
So this was a key kind of stumbling block in the negotiations. The Pacific Island states were really interested and wanted to make sure that they were part of the process. They weren't just observing from the outside. And their key request to richer nations for that was that they were given the money, the technological capacity, the training, so that they could really participate in both protecting the deep seas, also in any discoveries that are made. So when those, there's the new drug on the market is discovered from the deep seas, that they could actually benefit from that, and they could be part of the research, not just, as you say, observing from the outside. And now with this final treaty agreed, they very much have been included in that process.
Mm-hmm. The damaging impact of plastics was finally acknowledged. How do they intend managing this sort of monstrous problem globally?
Exactly. It was the first time that plastic pollution was included within the tax. So this was quite a big step forward for environmental groups. How they actually do that will require connecting up with different treaties, different plans, different legislation. So this treaty in itself won't tackle plastic pollution. But what it's hoped is by including it in the text, it will send a signal to countries that they need to really tackle this as an issue, either by banning plastics or by putting responsibility on producers to cut down on the amount of plastic.
What you talk about not all countries having signed up, what countries have not opted into this process, and which ones could be of concern going forward?
So all countries were at these negotiations. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, moving forward, they need to sign it, but there are concerns about particular countries. So I'll give you an example. In the closing plenary, as we call it, or the closing talks, Russia raised an issue with the tax. They said that they weren't happy how quickly it'd gone through. They still had to look at it. So they are of a concern that they won't actually legally ratify this.
Has China signed up for it?
So they will now take away the text and look at it, and we'll be watching closely for those big nations because they could really have a significant impact on whether this is a successful treaty or not.
Yeah. You talked about some of these environmental impact assessments. What do you think could be some of the key takeaways from that sort of work?
So it's hoped that in doing those, we can really begin to understand the impacts on the marine life. I'm giving an example of activities that they'll be assessing. So it'll be fishing, they'll be looking at fossil fuel exploration, but they'll also be looking at deep sea mining. And this has been a very controversial issue. It's yet to be carried out in these high seas, these international waters, and it's not yet known fully the impacts of that. So it's hoped by undertaking these assessments, we can really begin to understand what those impacts could be and whether this type of mining should go ahead or not.
This has been such a touch and go process throughout. Do you think, having observed it and reported on it, this is a good outcome considering how difficult it is to get agreement?
Many observers would say, it's only the first step, we've got to implement it, but I think it really is a historic moment. As I mentioned, it's taken 10 years to get to this point, and considering the current geopolitics of the world, to get all the countries in a room and actually sign up in principle to doing this, I think is a really momentous achievement.
Yes, it is quite remarkable when you think, as you point out, the state of politics globally at the moment. Esme, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks.